Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Big Bros podcast. My name is Ilan and I'm joined by my lovely friend and co-host Jeremy. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. I'm good considering obviously everything going on in the world, which, we're no strangers to seeing what's going on in the world right now. Obviously, there's a lot of disruption happening across the world globally, and it's taken a toll on a lot of what we're seeing and a lot of what we're viewing and going about in our day-to-day lives. But all things considering, I'm personally well. How are you?
I think I'm pretty much what you just described, which is all things considered, I'm fine, I'm healthy, and that's the most important thing. You're right, there's a lot of terrible and tragic things happening across the world right now, as I'm sure most people know just by, consuming media. But yeah, all things considered, we're all good, which is the main thing.
That's the most important thing. And yeah, I think that's a main reason or a key reason as to why we thought about recording an episode like this week. We seem like it's quite fitting that, we should all stand for things that are important to us in our lives, right? Whether it be about religion, identity, values, your friends, your family, whatever it might be, it's important to stand up for something that you truly do value. Otherwise, you're at risk of, not standing for something at all and being taken for granted or being stepped over. And we don't want that to happen, especially in our formative years and going into our 20s when we're that formative.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there, which is if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for anything. That speaks to the importance of not digging your head, or rather placing your head in the sand when shit around you is falling away. We speak a lot on this show about having personal boundaries, and that could be in contexts such as your relationships. You don't allow people to, step on your toes where you don't see fit. You'll stand up for yourself, but it doesn't just apply to these kind of relationship situations. It applies to things that you value, because that's the thing about standing for something. There's a deep and core first principle value within you that tells you not to tolerate certain things and to stand up for things. And I think obviously we kind of prefaced at the start that with everything that's going in the world, there is a time to stand for things that you believe in. And I think today we want to actually illuminate the importance of why you should do that as a young person. One thing for sure is when you start to developing your values and what you believe in, it becomes part of your identity. And the cool thing about that is if you really truly believe in something, you have almost these values and principles that guide your behavior. So when something does happen where you've got an ethical decision to make, you have some sort of values to guide you. So it might seem a little bit broad and abstract, and we'll bring in some examples shortly, but that's one thing. Number two is it gives you vision, right? If you truly believe in something and you are going to stand for it, you're going to have more tangible goals in your life. You might do things such as fundraising, donations, lobbying for whatever you believe in. But in and of itself, it gives you a purpose and vision. And I think as humans, our biggest fulfillment, if you ask anyone who goes into those allied health courses, why do you want to join this profession? The universal answer is, I just want to help people. And the reason that's such a fulfilling thing is because that's part of our human nature. At least that's what I believe. We want to help people, and by standing for maybe political or social movements, we directly help people, and that can be a major form of fulfillment.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it any better. And why is this so relevant to think about in our 20s, in our adolescence, going into adulthood? Is because we're often faced with these dilemmas, these situations where you're going to be asked to do certain things. You're going to be encouraged to do certain things, and people are going to maybe discourage you from doing things that you might want to do, perhaps, whether it's, alcohol or drugs or activism for something or just a hobby, perhaps. You're always going to be influenced by those around you. So having that core identity of what is it that you truly want to stand by, those values, really helps navigate your decision making. It helps encourage you to develop that moral compass when you're faced with situations that really have different road passes to what they could go down rather. And that is so important in shaping who we are in our early 20s. And it comes with pressure as well, because we're so often encouraged to think that when we do hit this age, we need to know what we stand for. We need to know what values are important to us, who we are aligning with, what we are aligning with, what we enjoy, what we don't enjoy. There's so much pressure that comes with us. And the best way to navigate that and to, maybe learn about what it is you do enjoy and what it is you don't is by talking to those around you, educating yourself, talking about the things that matter, learning about the things that matter, and also being really good at recognizing what is garbage, which we'll go on to talk about a little bit later. But I think it's also comforting to know that when we are in this stage in life, you don't need to have all the answers, and you shouldn't have all the answers, because we're so young and we're just a sponge, and we're just finding our feet, like you said last week and a couple of weeks ago as well. We're just finding our feet at this age. So let's erase that pressure that we might be feeling and actually come to that realization that, hey, it's okay if I don't know what I should be feeling and what my values are at this age. And that's a good thing, because it means that I'm more open to learning about different things. What do you reckon?
No, I completely agree. You're never going to know all the answers, no matter how much wisdom you've got. Maybe when you're a 70 or an 80-year-old, even then, people don't have all the answers. But you should always seek the truth, and you should always try and pretty much stand up for what you believe in, and continue developing those values that you hold, dear and near.
I just want to cut you there, because that's a very good point you make about always developing your train of thought, right? And I just want to illuminate something really nice, which I read today on the Daily Aussies post, which was talking about the current referendum in Australia for the voice to Parliament. And that highlighted the fact that over the course of the last few months, young Australians have actually developed their thoughts and have actually changed the way they think about the voice to Parliament. Back in August, I can't remember the statistics, but since August, the amount of popularity it's gained has increased amongst young Australians. But at the same time, young Australians also voiced that, they are more well informed in their decision making versus when they were initially. And I think that's a really important point for us in our early 20s is sometimes we're really quick to make decisions without actually looking at things holistically or assessing the situation holistically. And it's a credit to us as young Australians and young people in general also that we're not afraid to say that we might be incorrect, and we're not afraid to voice that we are open to changing our decisions. So developing that change in our thinking is something I think as young people in our 20s we're really good at, and it's being illuminated currently.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic thing, and that's probably a credit to the kind of the society we live in. You have that freedom of speech where you can stand up for what you believe in and promote the things that are near and dear to you. Because, and I'm going to bring in some historical examples here, we all want to make a positive impact, generally speaking. If you're a person who tries to do good, you're going to try and do good for those around you. And we don't have to look too far in history to see where people didn't stand for anything. I want to take us back to 1930s Germany. It's no secret what happened then. Jewish people were being massacred and exterminated. And shortly prior to the Holocaust, there was a conference called the Evian Conference, where Germany was hell-bent on getting rid of its Jewish population. Of all the countries that met, none of them wanted to take in Jewish people. This is with the fact that they knew that if they rejected them, they were going to be slaughtered. Instead, what these countries did in 1939, or 1938 rather, was that they said, nah, we're just going to put our head in the sands. And what ensued was 6 million lives that were lost at the hands of burying your head in the sand. And it's a grim example, but it speaks to the importance of why you need to stand up for something. Those are countries deciding to bury their head in the sands. But the problem there is if you do that, consequences can ensue. And awful consequences, tragic ones, barbaric, and that's what exactly that happened in Germany. The Rwandan genocide was another example. There was a slaughter of an ethnic minority there, killing almost 800,000 people. That was another example where the West decided to, or just maybe more, just the globe decided to bury their head in the sand. And another example that's even now happening is the Uyghurs genocide. I apologize if I mispronounced it, but it's the Islamic community in China. They're currently being sent to concentration camps where they're being sterilized, work like almost similar conditions to what Jews were exposed to in Nazi Germany. Same sort of thing. And you look at all these injustices now, and we're lucky because we don't experience any of these things. We're really, really in a privileged position. I can't overestimate that enough. But what I can say is, given we live in a society where you have that freedom to stand up for things, we absolutely need to. It's almost an onus on all of us to take a stand against evil. Because, irrespective of what your politics are, I think everyone, whether you're right, you're left, you're more authoritarian, you're more libertarian, it doesn't actually matter. If you're more religious or more secular, most people, they have a good heart, are against whatever the term is, but evil. They're against evil. And these examples that I just mentioned now are just core examples of why you need to stand for something, because the consequences are dire.
Summed it up perfectly. And you've brought in some really powerful examples there across history, across, many different types of people that have experienced sorts of things at the hands of ultimately the rest of the world staying silent and letting those things happen, right? And one thing mentioned particularly after the Holocaust is the phrase never again, right? Never again meaning the hope that never again shall something like that happen, shall something of such barbaric behavior happen again, but also never again shall people be bystanders, and shall people essentially let something like this happen again to people, in times of such helplessness. So it's a quote that is really powerful because it looks at the situation from the perspective of the people involved in the situation. Never again shall something so horrific happen to those people, but it also includes the whole rest of the world and everyone watching. Never again shall other people let something of that happen again. Now, Elie Wiesel, famous Holocaust survivor and famous author, also has a really powerful quote, which I like to think about when we're often thinking about, human rights activism and thinking about standing up for yourself and standing up for others when, they might need your help, essentially. And his quote goes like this: "What hurts the victim most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander." And I think that speaks volumes as to those points you mentioned, because it really encapsulates that there's going to be oppressors in our lives. There's going to be people that are going to try to beat us down to earth. And this goes for even if you're a young kid in the schoolyard. There's going to be that bully that's going to try to beat you down and bring you back down to their level, essentially, because perhaps they might see you as a threat to them. They might see you achieving. They might see you chasing your dreams or doing whatever it is you're putting your mind towards. So they're going to try to beat you down. But if there's another kid by your side there who's just standing and watching, and you're the victim and you're witnessing that person just watching this all unfold, that's really what hurts you more than the oppression that you're receiving from the oppressor. It's knowing that someone is there watching it unfold and not standing up for you and not trying to intervene. And I think that's something that we can really take on board in whatever it is in life. It's not something that needs to be spoken about just in times of, global conflict, but in day-to-day life. If we're seeing bullying, if we're seeing racism in the streets, if you stand for something, call it out. And there's so many people that have been really good at doing that in history and in modern day, but there's also a lot of people that can learn from this and can try to better themselves in this realm of practice.
I completely agree, because truthfully speaking, as a bystander, it's difficult. It's not that you might not care about the individual being oppressed, but you have your own self-interest. You don't want to get hurt potentially. You don't want to be ridiculed. You don't want to be dragged in. And those are all Those are all understandable reasons because it's difficult to stand up, but in light of the difficulty, it's still probably quite necessary. Because truthfully speaking, it may have been more of a headache for countries in 1939 to take in Jewish refugees. But what was worse was the catastrophe of not letting them in, or rather not helping out, rather not standing up. By being a bystander, you almost delay the consequences of it. Because I think you're also in a situation where if you do witness something happening, you don't do anything about it, you don't intervene, you run the risk of hating yourself after. Because chances are there was a voice in the back of your head telling you, hey, you should really stand up for this. You should really help out that person. There's a reason why we applaud Good Samaritans. You've heard the stories before where a Good Samaritan might intervene where someone's trying to rob an old grandmother of her purse. And the person who intervenes might end up getting assaulted, and they're the ones who end up getting injured. But we as a society applaud them. We applaud them because we know on a fundamental level, they decided to disregard their fear in that situation, and instead stand for what they believe in. And that's, civility. That's safety, for protecting those who are a little bit elderly. We hear it all time and time again. And I think even with bullying, we now hear it at schools where you're taught not to be a bystander. You're taught to tell a teacher. You're taught to not allow those things to happen. Because I think there's also Australia is a really cool country in that this is more to do with bystanding. My dad, when he first immigrated from the former Soviet Union, he said to me the first thing he realized about Australia was how no one here is generally a bystander. And he gave me a really good example. On one of his first days where he was driving to work, he saw that someone tripped and fell on the sidewalk. And within 5-10 seconds, everyone got out of their cars because it was an elderly person. They came running. They didn't want to be bystanders. Although there was no oppressor, the mentality here is everyone wants to help one another out. He said back where, he grew up, that would never be the case. People would have just ignored the situation. And I think that's a credit to our society. I think Australia is very much built on mateship and helping one another out. It doesn't matter if you don't know my name, I don't know your name. You're still going to be happy to help one another out. And even if it is frightening, but it's definitely way more difficult to stand up for someone when your life's at risk. And obviously you need to make a calculated risk there. Sometimes you've got a family and kids. Is it worth, putting your life in danger for the sake of social justice? That's not for me to answer personally, but generally speaking, we should be promoting that idea of, standing up for things when you are in a situation where you can potentially intervene.
Exactly. And when we think of, even day-to-day examples like you mentioned, we're going to come across people that might need some added help on the streets. Maybe you're on a train, right? And there's limited seats available, or a tram and there's limited spots available there. And there's elderly people coming on, or, people that might have a disability and they would benefit from sitting down rather than standing up, It's really easy to turn around and say, well, I also want to sit down. I've had a tough day at work. I've been standing on my feet all day. I'm really tired. It's like, why should I have to stand up? Someone else can stand up and do it. But I think those are the moments where in your mind and in your heart what should be done in that situation. And when you don't act in that situation and according to your heart and according to what your value is, you will eat yourself up later about that and about not acting in that certain way. And I think sometimes that can be more powerful to us as humans than somebody else telling us what we should or shouldn't have done in that situation. And it can be as simply as even when it comes to being in school and doing your homework, or submitting something that you should submit, or going that extra mile for, a classmate or a teacher, but you don't feel like it, right? It's very easy to just cop it and hear the criticism from a teacher or a parent or a family member or whoever it might be. But when you know in your heart of hearts that you should have acted in a certain way and you didn't, that little voice in your head will eat you up more than what anybody else can eat you up around you. And we all know that. We've all experienced that voice in the head when that happens. That still happens for me on a daily basis. You know, if it's something that I've set for myself to do and I haven't done it, you know, it's that voice in your head that can eat you up about, you know, not acting in a way that you should have done. Or maybe you said something to someone that you know is wrong and you didn't mean it, but maybe you didn't apologize in that moment. But then afterwards, upon reflection, you realize, far out, that was really shit of me and I should have apologized or said something. So there's always going to be those people around us to tell us what we should say, how we should act, what we should believe in. But in your heart of hearts and through your critical thinking, and this is part of being in our early 20s, you will eventually come to know what those values are you align with and hopefully abide by them, because you will know deep down that at the end of the day, it's between you and nobody else is going to tell you to act otherwise, or it's not going to hurt you to hear it from anyone else but yourself.
I mean, what you just said there is probably a classic example of why you should never break your own personal promises. If you want to build trust with yourself, you do things that are in accordance with your gut instinct. And your gut instinct generally knows the truth. It usually tells you what the right thing is. But that can also get us in trouble in situations, and this is something I want to kind of speak about because you just mentioned the whole idea of critical thinking. Oftentimes, people will join movements or adopt a certain political view, a social view, any form of kind of line of thinking, but not because they truly believe in that matter, but probably because of either things like misinformation, number one, or number two, they truly don't give a shit about what they believe in. They want to do what's considered socially admirable. They just want to be trendy. They want to be alternative, right? Yeah. And that's not doing anyone any favors, because when it comes down to it, that same person who's promoting a movement they don't really give a shit about won't be the person that donates their own money to help out that movement.
Or stands up when calling something out, you know, when hearing something unfavorable in the streets.
Correct. So critical thinking comes into it, because especially if you're a person with good intentions, and let's say you see a conflict that's going on in the world, right? It can be any conflict, and you're seeing and you're consuming mass media. This is a perfect opportunity where you need to separate yourself from just a consumer, but someone who can be actively looking at things, for example, from why they're presenting a story in the way that they are. So the thing is, when in a world where there's a lot of information, you could argue, okay, like there's no excuse. You should be able to know everything. But obviously there's a lot of opinions, there's a lot of noise.
And sometimes it's harder to sift through all that noise and actually get to the crux of what the truth is.
And the best way to do that is by applying critical thinking skills. At university, they're big on that. They're huge on that. They try to drill that down. If there's anything you can take away from your degree, it doesn't matter what degree you do, it's to be a critical thinker. And I thought about some questions that help me in my own time, you know, that when I hear something or I read something, because maybe when I was younger, and this is another really important point, we're way less skeptical when we're younger. Skepticism tends to increase with age because you've been burnt in the past. You don't have as much trust for things. We might have more trust in institutions and media when we're younger. But as you get a bit older, you say there's a bit of bullshit in the world, you're going to start being a little bit more skeptical, a little bit more cynical. You want to make sure that you don't the pendulum doesn't swing all the way to the other end. But things that you could do to help your critical thinking is things like this. Ask yourself, what is the source of the information that's being provided? What's the
credibility essentially of it?
Yeah,
right?
What's the credibility? Who's the person? If a doctor is not, I mean, we saw it with COVID, right? You had a lot of people saying X, Y, and Z about the COVID virus. And people who were, well-established doctors, they were even speaking shit. You know what I mean? There'd be doctors from Harvard who would get into debates with doctors from another, elite Ivy League school like Yale. And they would debate, for example, the efficacy of the vaccine, the efficacy of lockdowns. And irrespective of who was right, obviously you want to have a good source. And the point I'm trying to make here is you want to take your medical advice from a doctor, right? You don't want to, and I'd rather take my plumbing advice from a plumber.
That's right.
Do you get what I mean? That's a really sort of two interesting examples, but that's the point. You got to know where the information's coming from. What's the source? You got to want to know if there's a main argument in there. Is it just noise, or is there actually something that it's trying to say? Importantly, what's the evidence to back up what they're saying? If it's an opinion article that you're reading online, where is the evidence? Have they missed some bit of context that's not even there? Because that's huge. We can be seduced into thinking something when not all the pieces of info are there. Are there any counter arguments or opposing viewpoints? Right? Oftentimes we read an opinion article or we consume media, even if it's done in an objective way, and we can often forget that there might be an opposing view. Right? Even if that oppositional view is weak or there's not much evidence to support it, there probably is one that exists. And also know, what are the implications of this argument? Are there going to be any consequences from it? Is it a dangerous line of argument? By you adopting it, is it going to have some sort of, are there any sort of social consequences to this argument? And things like just assessing and evaluating, as you do in VCE when they say evaluate this question, look at the strengths and weaknesses of it. It takes time, but that's the price you have to pay to actually understand what you're reading. And even now, I'll consume things, and even if I truly believe in what they're saying, I still try to be a critical thinker. You know what I mean? I do this a lot with my cousins, where we might have very similar values, but one of us will just play devil's advocate. We'll just play devil's advocate for the fun of it, and it's a great way to actually assess whether
what you're saying is bullshit, or what you're saying.
Do you believe in what you're saying?
Truth.
Do you know what you're talking about? You know what I mean? That's the best way to do it, is to debate it, to challenge it, to stress test those ideas.
Yeah, and to even call your own arguments and viewpoints into question. Because like we said before, we might be wrong in what we believe occasionally. And the willingness to be able to change that and to be open to having your thoughts adapted is part of critical thinking, right? It's part of reflective practice, which we're also so ingrained and encouraged to do in university. They love reflective practice as well. They love, peer reviews. They love, getting you to challenge other people, challenge your peers, challenge yourself, do some reflective practice. So I think those 2 points can be applicable across all realms of life, and 2 tools that university, I'd say, I would give a lot of credit for and teach us really well, because ultimately we live in a world now where indoctrination is easier than ever, propaganda is being spread quicker than ever, and people take it. People like headlines, people like clickbait, people like thumbnails, and it's so easy to be sucked into this universe of bullshit, essentially. So sifting through that and going through those critical thinking questions, which you so eloquently just outlined, is such a key tool for us, especially in our early 20s, to again think about what it is we value, what it is we want to learn, so that we can actually form these beliefs and base our beliefs on true education and not just what's so trendy. Because that trendy point you mentioned is unfortunately so common now in 2023. People just hop on bandwagons, but those bandwagons might not necessarily be based on truth.
Mate, it's the same celebrities who will promote the importance of reducing carbon emissions, yet they have a private jet and they use that private jet, 10 times in a week.
Yeah.
And they end up, doing more damage to the world than an individual who, doesn't go on any holidays, who barely uses air travel.
Exactly
but
right.
They're going to be the
prime
same
example.
one. They're the prime example. It's a bit of a dig at celebrities. Cough, Leonardo DiCaprio. Seriously, but it's true though, because I don't believe in what they promote. I just don't. I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by a celebrity about this certain political movement or this social movement when they don't even believe in it themselves.
Can go with same example with like sponsorships. You see so many influencers promoting these different sponsorships that they might not necessarily stand for and believe in, but money talks, and if they're getting paid big bucks, then that will be enough to entice them. But then again, I think people are starting to get really good at seeing through the bullshit, and true fans of people know when someone is promoting bullshit and when they're actually promoting something that they do truly believe in.
It's interesting because there's a famous fitness well, personal trainer James Smith, British lad, really funny guy, but he takes a shot at a lot of personal trainers who will promote products that they don't ever use themselves, or these so-called health influencers. So he's made like a really funny parody video before where he's like, I wake up at 6 a.m, I meditate for 10 minutes, I have my lemon water because that somehow does something, and then it cuts to like him being like, oh, is the camera off? Okay, great. Uber Eats is here. So the point he's trying to make is a lot of people of status will promote things because they get money from it. But when it comes down to it, they don't actually, use the product, or they don't actually believe in what they're selling. I've always wondered, celebrities that have certain, perfumes and colognes, do you reckon they wear it?
Oh, because
David
about,
Beckham.
Yeah, because think about it like this. A David Beckham bottle of cologne costs you what, $30 from Chemist Warehouse. Do you reckon David Beckham's really wearing a bottle worth $30 on him?
Well, if he's a smart man, he'd be going for Mont Blanc, like myself. But it's true. But we digress.
We digress. And like we were mentioning prior, in terms of taking a stand and being well versed in what you're saying before you take that stand, and educating yourself, and sifting through the indoctrination, sifting through the propaganda, we also need to ask ourselves, what is the risk with taking a stand? Because I think that's a key factor as to why a lot of us in our 20s are afraid to take a stand sometimes, especially when it's on a public platform, because we're scared, essentially. Like there might be a risk that comes with taking a stand.
I'm going to be truthful with you here. I was just thinking about this before. I think we're going to risk taking a stand for things when it is directly linked with our identity. If there's something that's going on and it's affecting potentially an oppressed group, and that, we align with that group and that's part of our identity, we're way more likely to stand up for them. Knowing that something's intrinsically part of your identity, if you really value community, and that's a massive thing, and you see some sort of oppression against a community of people, you're way more likely to risk it, because you're going to stand up for your personal identity, generally speaking.
You're exactly right. And you run the risk of being called out because, like you said, it is your identity, and people might say to you, well, there are other identities, and these identities believe things that are contrary to what you believe, right? So you run that risk of potentially being, I guess, ostracized. But if you're a person with really strong willpower in what you are saying, and you really do believe in what you're saying and what you value, you run that cost-benefit analysis in your head, and you're prepared for any potential public humiliation, right? Because at the end of the day, you know that that's just background noise, and that's just not going to stop you, because if you truly believe in something, you're going to stand up for it, right? Whether it is about bullying or whether it is to do with racism, right? Like Adam Goodes is a perfect example that comes to my mind when I think about this. He was playing a football match for the Sydney Swans against Collingwood way back when, right? And a 13-year-old girl at the time was sitting on the other side of the fence and made a racist remark to him over the fence. What did Adam Goodes do in that moment? He essentially called her out in front of everyone involved. The game stopped. He called her out, and he asked for this young girl to be escorted. Now, Adam Goodes in that moment faced a lot of backlash and public humiliation because people thought that it was wrong of him to call out a young girl, a young individual. People said, well, she's not necessarily educated. She might not know what she's talking about. She just made a mistake. And whilst people do make mistakes, I stand with what Adam Goodes did in that moment, because what he did was act on what he truly believes, what he values, because what he did in that moment doesn't just have an impact on him. It has an impact on a much wider community of people, and a much wider community that would have wanted him to act in that way in that moment. And when we talk about education, oftentimes education could be biased, right? So this young girl saying that she wasn't educated in that moment, well, this is a perfect example to receive some education if what you're doing and how you're acting is wrong, and if it's offending people. So sometimes people need to just be open to education from other platforms other than those of what's in their family home in those four walls. So Adam Good's perfect example of standing up for what he believes in, regardless of that public humiliation potential and regardless of any ostracism. And I think that's something that a lot of us need to take on board, whether it is something on such a grand scale or whether it's something in the schoolyard, because there are always going to be people that are going to call you out. Like you said, when it's about your identity in particular, you're going to get called out. But if you really stand for what you believe in, you don't care and you recognize it as just noise.
It's true, because at the time, whether you agree or disagree with what Adam Goods did, it still was a marker of his character that he wasn't going to tolerate someone making a direct attack on his racial identity.
Yeah.
And even if it was at the expense of embarrassing a girl who was uneducated, he didn't care the backlash, because the greater goal was more important here, which is we have to stamp out racist remarks.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with what he did, technically speaking, but obviously some might argue that the way he did it was in question. But, make of that what you will. But you mentioned something important there, which is education. You're going to be receiving a lot of education when you're younger. And as kids, we're sponges. We'll absorb a lot of things. And sometimes that means actually having, classic 1930s Germany, they were teaching kids about how bad Jewish people were. There was a book called The Poisonous Mushroom. I'll quickly just have a look at the exact synopsis of it. But the idea there was that inside the book, the comparison to the mushroom was explained when a mother would tell a child, just as it is difficult to distinguish between a poisonous mushroom and an edible mushroom, it is difficult to distinguish between a good Jew and a lying, thieving Jew. And that is just a pure example of how how barbaric societies will educate their kids with crap, with nonsense, not just misinformation, but just vile ideas. And again, we're lucky in Australia that things like this have never, there was a time and place where things like this was, part of the education, not to the same extent, but obviously we have our own history with the First Nations people. But in any case, if you are going to apply your activism or something you do believe in, there are things you can do. First prerequisite is know what the hell you're talking about, know your values, and really, really ask yourself, because it's not worth your time and money and energy to devote to something you don't actually care that much about, just because it's trendy, right?
Yeah.
So suppose you do find something that you truly believe in, dedicate your time, volunteer, participate in marches. You only have to look maybe 50 years ago, 60 years ago at the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King.
And I think something beautiful we saw about marches back then is people marched for what they believed in. They didn't march about, and they didn't rally for putting down opposition. They actually marched in unison. They marched in peace and in solidarity for what they believed in. Because oftentimes we'll see through the streets, even in Melbourne and in Australia, you'll see a march for something, but what they're actually saying in those marches is putting down opposition and maybe even putting them down to the point where it becomes racist and disgusting.
We saw it on Tuesday night. It doesn't matter, what faith you are, what political views you have. Some of the things we heard from the Sydney Opera House was disgusting. And that is a pure example of how protests can get hijacked.
Exactly right. So important that, if you are participating in activism, make it worthwhile and make it actually so that you are participating in a way that you're supporting for what you stand for and you're not just disgustingly denigrating other people or other ideas, because that's not a way to go about what you stand for. And we see it so often in politics, right? When we get to the time of an election, you often see the people going for the position of power where they actually don't talk about what they will do for the country or the city or the state. They'll actually just talk about what the other person won't do, who they're fighting against.
You look at the Trump-Hillary Clinton election in 2016, that whole election was based on character attacks.
Yeah.
He'd say things like, you'd be in jail, if it wasn't for this, you're not a person of integrity, whereas she would call him a racist, a bigot. And none of that election was based on what are we going to actually do for the US population. And I think that's actually just a modern day consequence of politics now. correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like politics back in the day was, even if you or I had differing political views, we could have a mutual discussion and a really respectful debate that was based on not attacking your character or you attacking mine, but rather attacking your ideas.
Yeah.
And, you know, that was it. But I feel like nowadays it's so difficult to have a discussion with someone that you might disagree with, because you automatically think that they're your enemy.
It's too much he said, she said, or they said, right? So you can't win. So the best way to eradicate that from happening is to know what your points are, know what your values are, what you believe in, based on education, based on truth, and just focus on talking about that. Because at the end of the day, no one can disregard you if what you're saying is based on facts, and no one can disregard your feelings, right? So if that's what you're going to be basing your arguments on and your activism on, then you're winning, right? Another point we can talk about in terms of standing up for what you believe in is essentially speaking out and calling things out. So often we see these rallies happening. People will attend rallies and march happily in big groups of people, because in big groups of people like that, or even on social media, you are essentially hidden in a way still. Either you're behind a keyboard or you're involved in a big crowd.
Hooliganism. The reason that, you know, soccer hooligans cause so much issues is because they're in groups.
In big groups.
They'd be cowards in a scenario where it's one-on-one sort of thing. They're not going to be vandalizing or screaming and shouting and behaving like animals if they're on their own. You're way more likely to cause destruction in a group.
Exactly. So I think the best way and the most powerful way you can truly show to yourself and show to others that what you stand for is true is by speaking out and calling out in person, whether it's in person of like a small group setting or even one-on-one with someone. If you hear something that you don't like or is just disgusting, tell them that it's that way and tell them why. Another way is actually invest your time in things that you believe in. Like,
not just investing time, investing money, right?
Money too.
Sorry to correct. Like, for example, there are so many brilliant causes and so many charities, but the best test of whether you actually mean what you say is by emptying your pockets for those causes. Obviously, don't break the bank, but giving something from yourself for a greater cause, it should fill you with pride. It should fill you that you actually are making a tangible, positive difference. It could be things like sending money for medical supplies in a country that's been burdened by a natural disaster.
Or even just sending money to hospitals to raise funds for a certain charity or a certain condition that they want to have research in, right? Like we see it all the time.
You don't even have to be political to stand for something. And that's something I actually want to mention, like before we do wrap up, is that you do not need it. You don't have to be a political person, but at least have values that you stand up for. You might you might be a very desperate person when it comes to the whole thing of curing chronic illnesses, something like cancer.
Yeah.
And that's something that you might stand for. And it's a bloody noble cause.
Yeah.
We see it with Ben Brown. He's done a fantastic amount of fundraising for cancer research in Melbourne.
Yeah.
He's an excellent ambassador. He's someone who you can actually look at and say, he stands for something, and he actually invests money and he dedicates time and energy into the things that he believes in.
Exactly right. Couldn't have said it better. So
sorry to cut you off.
Nah, mate. I think that's extremely important, and what I was alluding to, right? Because so often we think that, you know, standing up and donating has to do with, you know, a political belief, whether you're right, you're left, you're center, you're up, you're down, whatever it is these days. You just can't win because you think that people are just going to judge you for what your politics are. But let's just bring it back a notch, because what we've seen time and time again in the world, most of the time doesn't really often have to do with politics. It just has to do with values and basic human rights and standing up for not allowing something to happen because it goes against human rights and activism and the ability to just express who you are and who you want to be. So let's just stop thinking about politics in our day-to-day life and think about what it is to actually just be a human and why we like being a human and what we value in being a human. So on that note, I think we'll wrap things up.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we fully close this discussion, Ilan?
Yeah, look, I mean, briefly, Jeremy and I have our own values. We also have our own politics, but we're not here trying to promote a specific political view that's polarizing or anything like that. What we are trying to promote is that every individual should try and develop their values.
Yeah.
Your politics are usually a symptom of your values. So regardless of what your values are, your politics will usually follow. Our point here is try to be introspective with yourself. Know what you believe in. Because trust me, a life where you don't stand up for anything that you believe in, if you don't have some form of ambition, it's going to be a life that's vaporous.
Yeah.
Really vaporous. So on that note, if you see things and you know that you need to stamp certain things out or call them out, you do it, because we live in a civil society and part of that means having to not be a bystander.
Love it, mate. Couldn't have said it any better myself. On that note,
Be well informed as well.
be well informed. Have a great week, everyone. Happy Tuesday, and be critical thinkers.
Love it.